I should have known the job was too good to be true. Make $200 a night to sit at an undisclosed location from sundown to sunup. No previous experience required. Non-disclosure to be signed before hiring. Candidates who break NDA will be sued for breach of contract. Must have a strong constitution and a high moral fiber. Interested parties call number below. For a college student who was struggling to pay tuition, car insurance, and keep food in the dorm fridge, this sounded too good to be true. I looked at the party offering the services and discovered that I knew them. Dr. Crandler was a biomed teacher who had a bit of a reputation for being out there. He was said to conduct experiments after hours in the science lab, and if he hadn't had tenure, it was pretty likely that he would have been fired. These were all rumors, of course. I'd had Dr. Crandler last year for entry-level human biomes, and he was a delight. He turned out to be a huge Romero fan and loved to talk about zombies and old horror movies. We'd really hit it off, and when I called the number, he sounded happy to hear from me. "Oh, thank God. I was hoping someone reliable would call. I've lost 3 this week, and I'm beginning to think that I'll have to stoop to drastic measures." Whatever drastic measures were, Doc C didn't elaborate. He just told me to come to the science lab at 5:15 sharp. "And not a moment later," he added, before hanging up and leaving me with more questions than answers. I wasn't sure what to expect, but $200 was $200, and that would be able to put something in my body that wasn't ramen noodles this week, if the job was legit. So, about 4:30, I hopped on my bike and made my way across to the Werner May Science Building. It's a huge old brick building that's been on campus since the 1940s. They say it's been home to a lot of famous research, and more than one questionable clinical trial. I'd started to wonder if Dr. C was going to try to experiment on me, and that's why he was being so secretive. I decided that if that was the case, 200 wasn't enough. I had enough trouble scoring ladies with my pizza face, and I doubted having 4 arms or 2 heads would help matters much. I stepped through the door at about 5 o'clock sharp, and Dr. Crandler looked up excitedly. "Prompt as always. I remember that from my class. You were always early, and I like a student who's punctual. Come this way and let me show you what I'm working on. Before we start out, though..." He set a non-disclosure agreement in front of me, and I looked over it before signing my name to it. It was pretty standard stuff. Don't talk about what you see. Don't talk about what you're working on. Don't tell the media. Don't post it on the internet. Oops, guess I messed that part up. Yada 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 yada. After that, he tossed a black hood onto the table and told me to put it on. I hesitated, not having asked him anything about what we were doing yet. "You're, not gonna experiment on me, right, Doc?" He laughed, but it didn't sound particularly merry. No, my boy. I would never experiment on you. I have specific parameters, and I'm afraid you just don't meet them." I wasn't sure whether to be glad or insulted, but I put the hood on anyway. He led me through a door, down some stairs, outside, back inside, and then down some more stairs. Finally, we came to our destination, and when he took the hood off, I was in a little room about the size of an average dorm room. Inside was a table, a chair, and a glass jar with something floating inside. It was roughly the size of a spud, though if it was a potato, it was one of those big old Idaho jobs. I'd say it was about 2 feet tall, maybe half a foot wide, and it just sort of floated there placidly. "This is your job," Dr. C said, pointing at the jar. "What, just watch this thing? Easy peasy," I said, not yet understanding what I was agreeing to. "Just watch it till I get here to relieve you. Be careful, it's very tricky. It may try to get you to let it out. Do not let it out under any circumstances. For that, I'll pay you $200 a night." I put out my hand, being a man who signs deals with a shake, and Dr. C pumped my arm one good time before saying he was going to leave now. "I'm going to lock you in. If you have to urinate, there's a bucket in the corner. There are snacks and water in the mini fridge over there, though I would prefer if you not take your eyes off that jar." He started to protest about having to whiz in a bucket, but I just nodded and told him not to worry about it. A deal was a deal, as my old man liked to say, and when he left, I heard the door lock behind him. So, I settled in and took out my phone as I surfed Reddit and tried to stay awake. I kept an eye on the jar, looking up about every 30 seconds, but mostly I just sat there and tried not to fall asleep. That was the hardest part. It was boring, just sitting there for 10 to 12 hours, and I made a mental sticky to bring some coffee tomorrow. Doc had some snacks in the fridge, but kale chips and pita chips with hummus are not what a man desires when he's trying not to zonk out. The weird little thing in the jar didn't help matters much either. It was boring. All it did was float there, but I guess that wasn't quite true. Sometimes I would look up and find it looking at me, its weird brown body seeming to watch me. It couldn't really be doing that, since it didn't have any eyes, but I still felt very seen as I sat there on my phone. I made a note to bring a charger too, but luckily it lasted till the doc came back to let me out. He smiled as he handed me my $200 in cash at the end of my shift. "Do you feel anything? Any headaches or nausea?" I told him I didn't, and he invited me to come back tomorrow night. I told him for sure, and left 200 bones the richer. I kept watching his little science project for the next few weeks and ended up with an extra $1,400 in my pocket. I agreed to do it 7 nights a week, and as spring began, the nights got a little shorter too. Soon the sun was going down closer to 8, and I didn't have to show up until 7:30 or 8 o'clock. Getting a couple of $100 for 10 hours of work was boss, and I got a lot of Raid Shadow Legends played or Reddit scoped while I sat there and collected moolah for sitting on my ass. When I arrived Tuesday of the next week, however, something had changed in my little potato cash cow. The thing had an ear. Doc sat me down as the hood came off and asked if I noticed anything different about the little blob. I looked at it critically, but couldn't really see anything different. Doc didn't really like this answer and told me to look harder. After a few minutes of coming up with nothing, he sighed in an exasperated kind of way and pointed. "It has acquired an auditory opening for vocal resignation." The look I gave him must have told him all he needed, because he just shook his head and tapped the tank. "It has an ear hole." And I finally got it. After some looking, I realized what he was talking about, and he seemed pretty proud of himself. "We've been working with chemical stimuli, and I had a breakthrough when I finally developed some form of communicational peripheral." How do you know it can hear you?" It was his turn to look puzzled, until I pointed out that it didn't have any way to let him know that it could hear him. "Well, it kind of wiggles around when we talk to it or play music. It hadn't done that much before, so we think it must be able to hear us." He left after that, and I made sure to tune the volume up on my video some for the little dude, or dudette, so he could listen too. It definitely bounced around a little, dancing in the water a bit as it moved around in its glass tank. I thought it was a little funny and turned the volume way up as it wiggled and wobbled. By the end of the week, it had 2 ear holes and some little baby ears to go along with it. The doc told me to take a few weeks off after that, saying they had some experiments to run on the little thing, and I told him to call me back when he needed me. I took some time and spent a little bit of my money paying bills and settling some debts. By the end of the week, I was praying for a call from Doc C, and Sunday night, he obliged. "I could use a set of eyes next week if you're free." I told him I'd be there and pumped my fist in excitement. When he took the hood off Monday, he was rewarded by a "whoa" of interest from yours truly. The little sucker had a toothless mouth that it seemed to be opening and closing like a fish out of water. I came in Sunday to find it had grown it. "It's pretty interesting stuff," Doc C told me. "Has it spoken to you before tonight? Some of my assistants claim it has spoken to them by way of telekinesis, but you don't seem to have suffered any of the symptoms they've talked about." "Thankfully not, Doc. All this little guy does is float and make me money." Doc C nodded, looking thoughtful before leaving and locking me in for the night. I had just brought my phone out to start scrolling Reddit for the night when I heard a muffled voice from somewhere. I looked up, thinking someone was outside the door, but the door was solid wood. I looked at my phone to make sure I wasn't accidentally butt dialing somebody, but that's when I heard the slight tap in front of me. I looked up to see the little potato dude thing as it bumped the glass with its body, its toothless mouth forming words from behind its prison. "Hello? Are you there?" it asked, its words muffled by the water and glass. I looked at it, not sure if it could even hear me when I responded, but when it floated back a little, I guessed it probably could. "Hello, you sound different than the good doctor or his friends. Are you someone new?" "Not really. I've actually been here watching you for a couple of weeks." "Oh, you must be the one I couldn't reach. I'm glad we finally get to speak properly." I set my phone down, leaning in a little closer as I watched the little brown thing float in the off-color water that held it. "What do you mean? You only just got a mouth." "Yes, well, there are many ways that one can communicate, aren't there? I've been trying to touch your mind for weeks, but you don't seem overly receptive to my advances. Thus I had to find alternative means of communication. If we were to speak, that is." Its voice, despite being muffled by the glass, was very smart-sounding. Little dude was the smartest floating potato I'd ever met, though the list was just him at the moment. He sounded like the doc a little. He used a lot of big words and sounded like he knew a lot of stuff. I put my face a little closer to the glass as I looked at him, watching him float there and wondering what he might know. We talked a lot that night. Well, I talked a lot. The little dude kind of floated and listened, throwing something out every now and again. He wanted to know where he was and how he'd come to be in this little fishbowl and what the doc intended to do with him. I didn't know most of those things, and I told him so. He didn't seem too thrilled with that answer, but he still kept talking to me. He asked me about what I was studying and what sort of things I liked to do. I didn't pick up my phone much that night. Instead, I told the little guy about myself, and we talked for hours about nothing in particular. The clock said it was about 4 a.m. when the subject finally turned to what he really wanted. I wish now that we had just kept talking about me. "So, despite the fact that you can't leave this place, you could still take me out of the tank, right?" I snorted. "Why would you want that? It's really not much better out here than it is in there." "True, but I would very much like to experience life outside my bowl. I lack hands, or I'd do it myself, but you could help me out." "Sorry, little dude. You're a good hang, but I promised the doc that I wouldn't take you out. I think it was in one of those papers I had to sign to get the job." "Oh, no one has to know. You could take me out for just a second and then put me right back in." Its voice sounded kind of sneaky as it pressed its side against the glass. "No," I said, looking at the door like I'd been doing something wrong. I really shouldn't. Please, you have no idea what it's like to live in your own filth. Now that I have a mouth, I can constantly taste the stagnant water I live in. It's pure hell." "Dude, stop. That's not cool. You know I can't take you out. I told the doc But then it did the last thing I would have expected. It started to cry. I don't mean it was pretending to cry. The thing started loosing these tortured sounds that made me think that someone was going through a bad breakup. It sounded super hopeless, and it began to bump its body against the side of the glass. I picked up my phone and tried to ignore it, but it's hard listening to something that just cries and cries like that. I had a roommate once that just kind of gave up after his girlfriend dumped him, and he just lay in bed and cried until his parents finally came to get him. I never saw the old dude again, but I can still hear his sobs sometimes when I close my eyes. It was heartbreaking and infuriating, and I wanted to console him as much as I wanted him to shut the hell up. Please let me out. I can't stand this anymore. I need to get out. I need to get out. I need to get out. It yelled and screamed, begged and cried for an hour and a half, and when the key turned in the lock, I was never happier to see the doc. Doc C looked at the little creature in the jar and asked me what had happened. Nothing. It just started talking after you left, and when I wouldn't let it out, it started screaming and crying. Far from being angry or disturbed, Doc C seemed amazed. He started studying the thing through the glass before I reminded him that I was done for the night and needed to leave. He pulled himself away begrudgingly before handing me my money and putting the sack back over my head. I found an extra 100 in the pile that night, for my suffering, I supposed, and thought about not coming back that next night. The blubbering and crying had been a lot to handle, but I couldn't deny that the money was good, and it was helping me pay down a lot of my outstanding debts. Another month of this, and my rent would be paid for the next year. Another 2 months, and my credit card would be paid, and I could afford a new flat screen for the living room. The thing's wailing was a lot to handle, but what was a little more next to my financial freedom? I made sure to pick up some earplugs before I came back the following night, and that's how I spent the next week. In that week, the little creature grew an eye and 4 small fingers, 2 on each side of its body. The night I arrived to find it had an eye, it told me all night how I looked like a kind person, and how it didn't understand how I could just sit there and watch it suffer. The earplugs helped a little, but it seemed like I could still hear it through the plugs. It would start out trying to talk to me, trying to flatter me, trying to reason with me, but we would always end up with it crying and me trying to ignore it. It became harder and harder as time went on, and every night seemed to be a battle to open the tank or not, and let it out or just flip the table and smash it into 1,000 pieces. In the end, it always came down to the money, and I always managed to stop myself from doing something stupid. It was Tuesday when something I hadn't considered happened, though. Tuesday night started out just like any other. Doc C brought me into the room, took off the hood, and there sat the little creature in his glass prison. It smiled at me, and I could see a couple of teeth breaking the gums. It had 6 fingers now, and they made it look a lot like a bug as they wiggled energetically. It still had only the one eye, but the beginnings of a nose had started to form under it. It was a repugnant little thing, but the doc left and I settled in, keeping my mind on the money and that I just had to power through tonight. It would be over in 10 hours, and I could go back to my room and sleep. It spent the next 10 hours talking, pleading, crying, trying everything it could to gain its freedom. Well, that's not quite true. It never tried to threaten me. It probably realized that such a thing would have been pointless. It could no more have hurt me than my 2-year-old nephew could have, and decided on a different gambit. When it started its piercing wails again, I popped the earplugs in and shut most of it out. The plugs tuned the thing down to about a 2 and made it easier to ignore. I was just thinking about treating myself to some really nice noise-canceling headphones and forego the TV for another week when I saw someone familiar in a piece of Reddit news. I almost dropped the phone as I read the article, not sure what to make of it. Dr. Joseph Cranler arrested after trying to buy biological material from an undercover agent. The picture showed Doc C looking real unhappy as he was led away in cuffs. He was wearing the same clothes I'd seen him leaving the night before, and the article that followed didn't cheer me up. He'd been buying material for his experiment from a disreputable company, and finally he had put his trust in the wrong person, or maybe the right one, I guess. The agent had arrested him, and they were holding him for questioning. I felt a cold chill as I looked over at the little freak in the tank. Was this the sort of experiment he'd been buying materials for? I'd never thought to question if this thing was something the college had sanctioned or not, and now I realized that I might be part of an illegal experiment. They'd be coming for me next, me and this thing, and they'd assume that I was the Igor to his Dr. Frankenfurter or whatever. As the creature wailed and thrashed, my brain started putting blocks together that it should have a few minutes ago. My biggest problem wasn't that they would think I was involved. It's that if they didn't come and the doc didn't come, I would have no way out of here. I was trapped with this little crying dude for God knew how long. I thought about calling for help, but that would be bad too. What if they thought I was part of this? I'd have a hard time convincing them that I had nothing to do with this when they found me with the evidence. What's more, all the doc had to say was that I was his assistant, that he'd paid me, and I'd be in the same prison chow line as him. I started looking around the room for an escape route, but there was nothing. We were locked in. The little creature kept asking what was happening, but I just kept ignoring him. There were no windows, no other doors, not even a vent to squeeze into like in the movies. All the while, the creature wailed and pleaded to be released. It knew something was wrong, and it wanted to be set free. It could help me. It could get me out of here. It could do anything, as long as I would take it out of this tank. After searching the little room again and again, I finally just sat and tried not to go crazy. My phone will make calls, but I have no idea how to tell anybody where to find me. I tried to explain to the police what was happening. I even mentioned Dr. C, but I think the dispatcher thought I was high. They started hanging up on me when I called back, and if they trace my number, all they're going to find is my dorm room, which is empty. Luckily, I have a charger on me, so I can keep calling out and trying to get someone to help me. I checked the fridge, and there's enough bottled water and snacks in there to last for 3 or 4 days. Less if I feed this little bastard. I'm not even sure what it eats. I've never been given any feeding instructions for him, and I'm not going to waste my food on this squalling thing. I threw a tarp over it, but it isn't doing anything to dull the screaming. It sounds like he might have grown more mouths, because I can hear his shrill little voice from every angle as it bounces off the walls. One thing's for sure, if it doesn't stop screaming soon, I'm going to give him some kind of release. If it goes on for much longer, I'm going to wrench the lid off that tank and stomp the life out of him. If somebody doesn't come to help me soon, I'm going to release him from his suffering forever. You're still here. I thought you might be. Thanks for joining me for tonight's story. If your insatiable appetite for horror knows no bounds, might I suggest one of our playlists, or one of our previous stories in the archive? There should be one appearing at the end of the story any minute now. And of course, if you're not subscribed, why not go ahead and hit that subscribe button? Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the spooky things that we do here. If you prefer your horror a little more analog, you can always pick up one of my books. There's a link below to my latest, and it'll take you to all the great things that I've posted on Amazon. For my book lovers in the audience, I always suggest coming on down to Patreon so you can become part of my ghostly reader tier and get a book anytime I write one, which is usually about twice a year. Speaking of my patrons, let's go ahead and thank them, shall we? Thanks to Unicorn Hollow for being our spooky ghost contributor. Thanks to Janet and Lady Vengeance for being our spooky skeleton tier contributors. Thanks to Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Stephanie Carrington, Marianne Schuler, Tyler Parker, and Jennifer Damron for being our ghostly reader tier contributors. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you think you might like to support the show in a more monetary fashion, come on down to Patreon. I have many tiers. I'm sure you'll find one that suits you best. I always recommend the Ghostly Reader tier, since you get a signed book anytime I write one on your doorstep. But I have many tiers, and again, I'm sure you'll find one to suit you. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.